April 1945. Central Germany. The front line cuts through the heart of the Third Reich, turning the country into the stage of two converging offensives. In the west, American and British armies, methodically advancing deeper into German territory. In the east, Soviet armies, driven by bitter vengeance after 4 years of occupation, destruction, and humiliation. For millions of German soldiers and civilians, the moment had come for the most difficult choice of their lives. To whom should they surrender? The answer determined not only whether you lived, but also how you might die, what would happen to your family, and what kind of future awaited the next generation. The numbers speak for themselves. In just 2 spring months, from March to May 1945, more than 1,800,000 German soldiers surrendered to the Western Allies. Only about 400,000 fell into Soviet captivity. This was no coincidence and no chaotic accident. It was a conscious decision based on experience, rumors, and harsh reality. Everyone knew the difference between the two kinds of captivity. This story does not seek to justify the crimes of the Nazi regime or diminish the immense suffering of the Soviet people. It is about the instinct of survival, about that final choice a human being made in the midst of total catastrophe, a catastrophe Germany had brought upon itself. February 1945, Berlin. In the underground bunker of the Ministry of Propaganda, Joseph Goebbels launches his last great campaign. It is no longer about victory, that hope has already evaporated. It is about fear, about the cold horror meant to force Germans to fight to the last breath. Der Bolschewismus kennt keine Gnade. Bolshevism knows no mercy. Sie kommen, uns zu vernichten. They are coming to destroy us. Besser der Tod als die Rote Sklaverei. Better death than red slavery. These slogans blared from radios in every German household, but they did not fall on empty soil. Since 1941, Wehrmacht soldiers on the Eastern Front had been witnesses and participants in crimes of unprecedented scale. The Holocaust, burned villages, mass executions of prisoners, the annihilation of entire communities. All this left deep scars in the collective memory. People understood this war was unlike any other. In December 1944, Oberleutnant Hans Schmidt of the 6th Army wrote in his diary, Wir haben Dinge getan, für die es keine Vergebung gibt. We have done things for which there is no forgiveness. Wenn die Russen kommen, werden sie dasselbe mit uns machen. When the Russians come, they will do the same to us. His words echoed the fear of an entire front, and he had reason to believe it. By 1945, Germans knew the scale of Soviet losses and destruction. 27 million Soviet citizens killed. 3,300,000 POWs starved in German camps. Over 1,700 cities and 70,000 villages destroyed. Millions deported into forced labor. Every soldier felt the same thing. The Red Army was not coming as liberators. It was coming for revenge. Unlike on the Eastern Front, where the war was fought as a war of annihilation, the West largely observed international norms. The United States had ratified the 1929 Geneva Convention on the treatment of prisoners of war, and for the most part adhered to its provisions. Colonel James Mason, responsible for German POW affairs in the United States, wrote in a March 1945 report, Our policy toward German prisoners is based on strict adherence to international law. This is not only a moral obligation, but also a pragmatic calculation. We want Germans to surrender, not to fight to the death. The strategy worked. After the Normandy landings in summer 1944, Americans noticed that German soldiers were surrendering far more willingly than on other fronts. The reason was simple. They knew they would survive. Lieutenant Robert Thompson of the 82nd Airborne Division recalled, The Germans often approached our positions with white flags, especially those who had fought in the East. Through interpreters they would say, We don't want to go back east. A contrast in treatment. The difference between the Western Allies and the USSR in their handling of prisoners could not have been starker. American POW Camp, Kansas. Oberfeld Werner Stein was captured in March 1945 near the Rhine. His experience was completely different from what he expected. Am ersten Tag bekamen wir warme Kleidung und eine warme Mahlzeit. On the first day, we received warm clothing and a hot meal, he wrote to his wife. Die Amerikaner behandeln uns korrekt, gemäß der Geneva Convention. The Americans treat us correctly, in accordance with the Geneva Convention. In Kansas, he worked on a farm with other prisoners. An 8-hour workday, 3 meals, medical care, and the right to write letters home. Es ist besser als in der Wehrmacht. It's better than in the Wehrmacht, he joked in a letter. Soviet Camp, Siberia. Unteroffizier Gerhard Koch was captured by the Soviets in January 1945 near Warsaw. His path ended very differently. Camp number 7825. In Magadan. 12 hours in gold mines, at minus 40 degrees Celsius. Rations of 400 grams of bread and thin soup. Medical care almost non-existent. Mortality about 40% per year. Koch died of exhaustion in March 1947. His family learned of his fate only in 1956, when the USSR handed over lists of deceased prisoners. Lieutenant General Heinrich Eberbach, commander of the 5th Panzer Army, was captured by the Americans in August 1944. His recollections vividly highlight the contrast. Die Amerikaner verhörten mich höflich aber bestimmt. The Americans interrogated me politely but firmly, he wrote. Sie wollten militärische Informationen, nicht Rache. They wanted military information, not revenge. Eberbach was held in a special camp for high-ranking officers in Mississippi. A private room, a library, the opportunity to write his memoirs. Meine Kollegen an der Ostfront hatten weniger good luck. My colleagues on the Eastern Front were less fortunate, he noted. The contrast was obvious even to American officers themselves. Major David Cohen, who worked with prisoners, wrote in his diary, "They all tell horrific stories about what their comrades did in the East, and they all repeat the same thing. We deserve punishment, but not the kind the Russians give." February-March 1945, collapse of the Eastern Front. On January 12, 1945, Soviet forces launched the Vistula-Oder offensive, the most powerful assault of the entire war. In just 23 days, they advanced over 500 kilometers, smashed Army Group A, and reached the approaches to Berlin. For the German army, it was a catastrophe. The front disintegrated. Millions of soldiers and civilians fled west in panic, desperate to avoid Soviet captivity. Colonel General Gotthard Heinrici, the new commander of Army Group Vistula, recorded in his war diary on March 21st. Discipline is completely broken. The soldiers think not of fighting, but of escape. Everyone dreams of surrendering to the Americans. The fate of the 257th Volksgrenadier Regiment illustrates the general picture of this retreat. At the start of 1945 near Warsaw, it counted 6,000 men. By April, only 800 exhausted soldiers remained, dragging themselves through Pomerania toward the Elbe. March 15th. We are retreating to Kolberg. The men throw away their weapons and flee westward. I am powerless to stop them. March 28th. Of 6,000, only 1,200 remain. Half are wounded or sick. April 10th. We have reached the Elbe. The Americans are only 20 kilometers away. The soldiers are deserting en masse. On April 25th, Bronner surrendered with his last 80 men near Magdeburg. We had no other choice, he wrote in his report for American intelligence. The retreat of the army was accompanied by the mass flight of civilians. About 12 million Germans left East Prussia, Pomerania, and Silesia, trying to reach territory controlled by the Western Allies. Ironically, the civilian flight was often more organized than the retreat of the army. The Nazi administration realizing the scale of the disaster, secretly issued evacuation orders. Gauleiter of East Prussia, Erich Koch, decreed in March 1945, all German civilians must be evacuated to the west. Better American occupation than Soviet revenge. But the orders came too late. Soviet forces advanced faster than the population could escape. Tragedies became inevitable. The worst was the sinking of the Wilhelm Gustloff on January 30, 1945, when more than 9,000 refugees went to the bottom of the Baltic. Paradoxically, the Nazi propaganda that for years had called Germans to a final battle now pushed them into flight. Endless tales of Bolshevik horrors created mass terror of the Soviet advance. Joseph Goebbels wrote in his diary on March 3, 1945, "Our propaganda about Bolshevik atrocities worked too well. Now even our own soldiers fear the Russians more than they want to fight for the Reich." This fear was reinforced by real tragedies. Refugees told of massacres in Nemmersdorf, rapes in Königsberg, deportations from Silesia. Rumors, even when exaggerated, created an atmosphere of constant horror. The result was predictable. Instead of fanatical resistance, Germans fled west en masse, hoping to find safety in American or British captivity. By spring 1945, the mindset of German soldiers had changed completely. Propaganda about final victory no longer worked. The soldiers prepared themselves for a different reality: defeat and captivity. Allied psychologists working with prisoners noted a characteristic tendency. Germans divided the occupiers into good and bad. The good were Americans and British. The bad were Soviet soldiers and the French, who also sought revenge. American military psychologist Dr. Henry Dever wrote in April 1945, "German soldiers are making a rational choice. They clearly understand the difference between Western and Eastern captivity and act accordingly." Unteroffizier Klaus Weber of the 12th SS Panzer Division Hitlerjugend kept a diary. March 20th. The Russians are 50 kilometers to the east. The officers openly say, "We must head west. No one wants to fall into Russian captivity." April 5th. "I've decided, if I surrender, it will be only to the Americans. I have 2 small children at home." These entries reflected the thoughts of the majority. Interrogations of prisoners conducted by the Americans in 1945-1946 showed that 89% of German soldiers consciously chose Western captivity. The position of the officer corps was equally telling. Professional soldiers who once placed honor above life now spoke openly about the advantages of surrendering to the Americans. Colonel General Heinz Guderian, on March 28, 1945, told General Krebs, "Our duty to the soldiers is to give them a chance to survive. The Americans will give that chance." Even within the Reich's top leadership, there were attempts at negotiation. Reichsführer SS Heinrich Himmler, in March 1945, through intermediaries, tried to establish contact with the Americans. His goal: a separate surrender in the West. The Allies rejected these overtures and insisted on unconditional surrender on all fronts. But the very fact of such initiatives showed that even the highest leadership recognized the difference between Western and Eastern captivity. April 1945. The regime in agony. By April 1945, the Third Reich existed only on paper. Territory under German control had shrunk to a few pockets in central Germany. The Allies pressed from 3 sides, and the fourth was sealed by the sea. In this situation, the behavior of the troops became paradoxical. From a military point of view, chaos and irrationality. But from the perspective of survival, cold calculation. Divisions that fought bitterly against the Red Army to the very end surrendered without resistance to Americans and Britons. A telling contrast: the 11th SS Panzer Division Nordland, manned by Scandinavian volunteers, fought in Berlin to the last man against Soviet forces. Meanwhile, the 21st Panzer Division, fighting in the West, surrendered to the Americans intact. The events of May 1st, 8th, 1945, revealed German priorities more clearly than any speech. May 1st, Army Group South, 180,000 soldiers, surrendered to the Americans. May 2nd, the garrison of Berlin, 134,000, capitulated to the Soviets. May 4th, Army Group Northwest, 500,000, surrendered to the British. May 5th, Army Group Center, 900,000, attempted to break through to American lines. May 7th, Army Group E, 600,000, laid down arms to British and Yugoslav forces. In total, during the last week of the war, 2,180,000 German soldiers surrendered to the Western Allies, while only 376,000 surrendered to Soviet forces. The tragedy of Army Group Center. The most tragic episode was the fate of Army Group Center, under Field Marshal Ferdinand Schörner. 900,000 soldiers and about 500,000 civilian refugees found themselves in Czechoslovakia, encircled by Soviet and Czechoslovak forces. On May 5th, Schörner received orders from Berlin to capitulate. Instead, he commanded a breakout westward toward American positions near Plen. Thus began one of the bloodiest operations of the war's final days. Lieutenant Colonel Helmut Stadtmann of the 4th Panzer Army recalled, "Es war ein Albtraum, eine Million Menschen auf 50 Kilometern Straße. Sowjetische Flugzeuge bombardierten die Kolonne ununterbrochen." It was a nightmare. 1,000,000 people on 50 kilometers of road, Soviet aircraft bombed the column without pause. Out of 900,000 soldiers, only about 150,000 managed to reach American lines. The rest were killed or captured by the Soviets. Of the 500,000 civilians, fewer than 50,000 survive. May 1945, Camp Rheinberg near Dusseldorf. In a vast tent city on the banks of the Rhine, about 100,000 German prisoners of war were held. Conditions were difficult: lack of housing, limited rations, poor sanitation. Yet for soldiers who had expected the worst, even this seemed merciful. Oberleutnant Werner Scholz of the 116th Panzer Division wrote in his diary, "Die Amerikaner haben ein riesiges Problem mit uns." The Americans have a huge problem with us. 2 Millionen Gefangene in wenigen Wochen. Das kann kein Land verkraften. 2 million prisoners in just a few weeks. No country can handle that. Indeed, the scale was unprecedented. From March to May 1945, the Americans captured more prisoners than in all the previous years of the war combined. The logistics of handling such masses overwhelmed even United States capacity. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, in a report to Washington on May 8, wrote, "We are faced with a problem of unprecedented scale. 2,800,000 German prisoners require housing, food, and medical care. Our resources are at the breaking point." Despite the strain, the Americans tried to comply with the Geneva Convention. At least 4 square meters per man, medical staff available, right to send mail. Feldwebel Hans Kramer of the 2nd Panzer Division described his experience. "Wir schlafen unter freiem Himmel, aber niemand schlägt uns. We sleep under the open sky, but no one beats us. Das Essen ist wenig, aber regelmäßig." The food is little, but it is regular. "Die amerikanischen Wachen sind korrekt." The American guards behave correctly. The picture was entirely different in Soviet captivity. The Gulag, originally built for the USSR's own prisoners, was expanded to take in Germans as well. The logic was simple: the enemy must repay the damage with his labor. Camp No. 7, 1825, in Vorkuta. Unteroffizier Gerhard Niemann of the 6th Army arrived there in February 1945. His notes, found after his death in 1953, reveal the atmosphere of Soviet captivity. Day 1. Arrival after 3 weeks in a freight car. Of 120 men in our wagon, 23 died on the way. Day 15. 12-hour shift in the mine at minus 35 degrees Celsius. Rations. 400 grams of bread and thin soup. Many have scurvy. Day 89. I weigh 45 kilos at 1.80 meters tall. Today Heinrich died. Niemann died of exhaustion in May 1947. His story was just one among millions. In Soviet camps, about 1,100,000 German prisoners perished. Official figures clearly illustrate the difference in mortality among prisoners. United States, 2,800,000 prisoners. Mortality, 0.15%, approximately 4,200. Causes of death, disease, accidents. Average detention, 2.3 years. Released by 1948, 99.7%. United Kingdom, 1,600,000 prisoners. Mortality, 0.03%, approximately 480. Causes of death, mostly disease. Average detention, 2.1 years. Released by 1948, 99.9%. USSR, 3,100,000 prisoners. Mortality, 35.8%, approximately 1,100,000. Causes of death, exhaustion, starvation, disease, overwork. Average detention, 8.2 years. Released by 1956, 64.2%. The survivor's syndrome. German soldiers who ended up in Western captivity often went through a difficult psychological process. On the one hand, relief at having survived. On the other, guilt over comrades who had perished or fallen into Soviet camps. Dr. Kurt Schneider, a military psychiatrist who himself became a POW in the United States, described it this way: Viele unserer Soldaten leiden unter Schuldgefühlen. Many of our soldiers suffer from feelings of guilt. Sie wissen, dass ihre Kameraden im Osten sterben, während sie hier überleben. They know their comrades are dying in the East while they survive here. This dilemma was especially painful for officers who had made the decision to surrender. Colonel Erwin Rommel, nephew of the Field Marshal, surrendered to the Americans in April 1945 with his regiment of 3,000 men. Later he wrote, Ich habe 3,000 Leben gerettet, indem ich kapitulierte. He saved 3,000 lives by capitulating. Aber ich fühle mich trotzdem wie ein Verräter, but I still feel like a traitor. For many Germans, American captivity became their first real contact with a democratic society. This caused genuine cultural shock, especially among young soldiers raised in the spirit of Nazi ideology. 19-year-old Wilfried Müller of the Hitler-Jugend Division noted in his camp diary, Die amerikanischen Wachen diskutieren mit ihren Offizieren. The American guards argue with their own officers. Das hätten wir uns nie getraut. We would never have dared such a thing. Even greater surprise came from the racial integration of the American army. African American soldiers, whom Nazi propaganda had painted as subhuman, turned out to be educated and disciplined servicemen. Sergeant Werner Stein recalled, Ein schwarzer Amerikanischer Sergeant spricht fließend Deutsch und erklärt uns die Lagerregeln. A black American sergeant spoke fluent German and explained the camp rules to us. Unsere Propaganda log über alles. Our propaganda lied about everything. In the summer of 1945, the Americans launched a large-scale program of denazification for prisoners of war. Its aim was to break Nazi thinking and instill a democratic worldview. The program included lectures on the values of democracy, screenings of films about concentration camps, studying history without ideological distortion, vocational training for post-war life. Colonel Daniel Brown, responsible for denazification, wrote in his report, We have a unique opportunity to reshape the German mind. These men will return home with new ideas about democracy and human rights. Reactions varied. Older officers largely rejected what they called enemy propaganda. Younger soldiers, especially those who had seen the horrors of war firsthand, were more often willing to listen. The most powerful impact came from a documentary made by Americans after the liberation of Dachau, Buchenwald, and Bergen-Belsen. Prisoners were forced to watch the footage of the camps. Reactions were mixed. Some refused to believe, others fell into depression. Unteroffizier Klaus Weber wrote, "Wenn das wahr ist, dann haben wir für Teufel gekämpft. If this is true, then we fought for the devil. Wie konnten wir so blind sein? How could we have been so blind?" Feldwebel Hans Schmidt reacted differently. "Das ist amerikanische Propaganda. This is American propaganda. Solche Grausamkeiten sind unmöglich. Such atrocities are impossible." He refused to accept the truth until his death in 1987. The effectiveness of denazification was uneven. Surveys from 1947-1948 showed 23% of prisoners fully embraced democratic values, 45% partially changed their views, 32% remained committed to old convictions. The best results were achieved among younger soldiers aged 18 to 25, and those who had direct exposure to American life, working on farms or in factories. From 1946 onward, mass releases of prisoners from American camps began. They returned to a devastated Germany, bringing with them a new vision of the world. Many had seen for the first time that democracy could be strong and prosperous, and that even after a bloody war, Americans had treated them humanely. Werner Schulz, former Oberleutnant, returned in 1947 and became a journalist. In his articles he wrote, "Wir haben gesehen, wie Demokratie funktioniert. We have seen how democracy works. Deutschland kann denselben Weg gehen. Germany can take the same path." Political careers of former prisoners. Many returnees went on to political careers after the war. Helmut Schmidt, Chancellor of West Germany, 1974-1982, held in British captivity. Walter Scheel, President of West Germany, 1974-1979, American captivity. Hans-Dietrich Genscher, Foreign Minister, 1974-1992, American captivity. Their experience shaped the course of West Germany toward cooperation with the United States. Personal memories of humane treatment by Americans strengthened their belief in democratic institutions. The contrast with returnees from the East. The fate of those who survived Soviet camps was starkly different. The last Germans were released from the USSR only in 1956, 11 years after the war. They returned physically broken and psychologically scarred. Many suffered from chronic illness, PTSD, and alienation from society. Gerhard Klein, who spent a decade in Soviet captivity, wrote, "Wir kamen als lebende Tote zurück." We returned as living corpses. Die Welt hatte sich verändert. Wir auch. Aber anders. The world had changed, and so had we, but in a different way. These returnees often became the most determined opponents of communism in West Germany. Their memories of the camps helped shape a strong anti-communist immunity in German society. Chapter 10: Historical Consequences and Lessons. Shaping the post-war order. The decision of millions of German soldiers to surrender to the Western Allies had enormous consequences. Accelerated demilitarization, the most combat-ready units came under United States and British control, laid the foundation for the creation of West Germany as an ally, deepened the divide between East and West. Lessons for international law. The experience of German prisoners showed respecting conventions, even in the most brutal wars, is key to both victory and reconciliation. Humane treatment of the enemy. Encourages surrender instead of fanatical resistance. Shortens the length of wars. Facilitates reconciliation after conflict. Enhances a nation's international reputation. General Eisenhower summarized in his memoirs, "Our treatment of prisoners was not only a moral obligation, but also a strategic tool. It convinced millions of Germans, better to surrender to us than to fight to the end. Impact on the Cold War. The contrast between West and Soviet handling of POWs became one of the markers of the emerging Cold War. Different standards of human rights and international law were especially evident during the Korean War, 1950-1953. At that time, thousands of Chinese and North Korean prisoners refused repatriation, choosing instead to remain in the West. In the 1980s, German historians began openly studying the issue of surrender choices in 1945. They emphasized the complexity of the moral dilemmas of the war's final months. Professor Hans Ulrich Weller of Bielefeld wrote, "The decision to surrender to the Americans was a rational choice between life and death, but it also reflected a deep awareness of the difference between totalitarian and democratic systems. Reconciliation through understanding." This story became part of the broader process of reconciliation between former enemies. It demonstrated that even in the darkest conflicts, humanity can triumph over vengeance. Today, museums in the United States, Germany, and Russia tell the story as a lesson. Humanity and respect for international law are the foundation for future peace. The events of 1945 still resonate today. In wars in Syria, Afghanistan, and Ukraine, the question of the fate of prisoners arises once again. International law requires constant defense and development. Humane treatment of the enemy is not weakness, but a strategic advantage. The mass surrender of German troops to the Americans in 1945 was no coincidence. It was a rational choice between different models of captivity, different chances of survival, and different visions of the future. This choice hastened the end of the war, laid the foundations of democracy in West Germany, and became the cornerstone of the transatlantic partnership. Above all, it proved that humanity and respect for dignity do not weaken till they make stronger. The story of the prisoners of 1945 is a lesson for all generations. How we treat the enemy determines not only their fate, but also our own.